In chapter 32, we're going to learn about the infinitive. So let's start with English. An infinitive is defined as a verbal noun. We already saw that participles are verbal adjectives, but infinitives are verbal nouns. And in English, we form them by taking the word to, and putting them with a verb. So to eat, to sleep, to pass, to fail. Those are all infinitives. Because an infinitive is a verbal noun, it can perform functions of a noun. For example, it could be the subject of a sentence. If you were going to say something like, to study Greek is my highest aspiration. To study is the infinitive. Greek is the direct object of the infinitive. And that whole phrase together, to study Greek, is in fact the subject of the verb, isn't it? To study Greek is my highest aspiration. So infinitives are verbal nouns, and even though they're formed with to and a verb, you can find them as subjects and direct objects and other things like that. Now, there is other ways in which infinitives can be used, though. They can, for example, complete the meaning of a verb. Some verbs just aren't complete in and of themselves. So you could say something like, I began. Well, I began what? Well, I began to sweat when the final exam began. Okay. I began to sweat. The infinitive, to sweat, is completing the sense of the verb. So anyway, in English, that's what an infinitive is. It's a verbal noun. When you move into Greek, you find the same thing, that Greek infinitives are verbal nouns. But one of the really nice things about Greek infinitives is that they are indeclinable. And that means that they have no person and no number. All right. Now, they will change the form based on tense. They will change the form based on voice. But they don't decline. They're indeclinable. Now, they are viewed as neuter singular. And why that's important is that often a Greek infinitive is going to be preceded with the article. And that article will always be neuter singular. But the article can be declined. The infinitive doesn't, but the article can. So let's say you had an infinitive that was functioning as the subject of the sentence. To review vocabulary is a good thing. Okay, to review is the infinitive, vocabulary is a direct object of the infinitive, but that whole phrase, to review vocabulary, is functioning as a subject, and therefore the article, while it's always going to be neuter singular, the case of it will be nominative because it's functioning as the subject of the sentence. So the infinitive itself is indeclinable, but it's viewed as singular neuter, and the article that often precedes it will be declined in terms of its case. It will always be neuter singular. All right. And as you saw from the illustrations, that infinitives can have modifiers like direct objects, to study Greek, to review vocabulary. Okay. But anyway, that's what infinitives are in Greek. Now, back when we looked at subjunctive, we saw that there were only two tenses because there was only two aspects in the subjunctive system, right? So the subjunctive built on the present tense stem is continuous. The subjunctive built on the unaugmented aorist tense stem is undefined. You may have been wondering about what about the perfect? Well, you're not going to have to worry about that when it comes to infinitive because all three aspects are representative in the infinitival system. So here's a chart that might help you keep all these things together. The infinitive that's built on the present tense system will indicate a continuous action, not time, just aspect. It'll indicate a continuous action. And in your translation, you may say something like to continually study. But again, as was true of subjunctives, it's really hard in English to bring the significance of the continuous infinitive into your translation. But you can use continually, at least for now, perhaps to help you get the idea of it. The infinitive built on the unaugmented, as you would expect, aorist tense stem is describing an undefined action, and we would use the simple to study as a translation. And the infinitive built on the perfect tense stem is indicating a completed action, and the best we can do at this point in English is to translate it with have, to have studied. So let's switch over to the infinitive morpheme chart. Now before we get into these different forms, recognize that all of the endings end in alpha iota except for the present active, which is then imitated by the second aorist active. If you start with just the present active form, the ane, then you're not going to see the consistency of these endings. And as normal, it's the present that's the problem. That's the pattern we've seen in Greek, isn't it? But all these endings, except for the present active infinitive, which is then copied by the second aorist, all end in alpha iota. So hopefully that will help you. And rather than trying to get more morphologically accurate in all these stuff, it's just easiest to memorize these 12 forms. Okay, so this is the chart you need to memorize. But the infinitive in the present tense system in the active is ein, and then in the middle passive it's esthai. In the first aorist, you will memorize it as psi. The sigma alpha is actually the tense formative, but go and just memorize it as psi. And then the first aorist middle, it's thasthai, and in the first aorist passive, it's thenai. So you can see the tense formative all the way through those three forms. Do you remember the second aorist in the participles? They borrowed the same on, usa, on that you have in the present, don't you? Same thing's happening in the infinitive. So the infinitive in the second aorist active is ein. In the second aorist middle, it's esthai. And then when you get into the passive, you do have the tense formative eta, and you have enai. Switch over to the perfect, and you have kenai. The kappa epsilon is the altered kappa alpha tense formative. And then in the perfect middle passive, you have the simple sthai. If you compare that to the present, you can see that probably the epsilon in esthai is the connecting vowel. So spend some time in these forms and see the consistency, see where they're the same, see where they're different, and then be sure you memorize this. Here's what they look like when you stick them onto a verb. And so spend some time in the chart and just go over and make sure it's all going to be clear. Again, you can see how the present and the second aorist are easily confusable if you haven't memorized your roots and stems accurately. But for the most part, these should be straightforward. And by the way, in translating, it's very simple. Just say to. So it's to loose or to be loosed in the present, to loose for oneself, I guess, in the middle, and to be loosed in the passive, to have loosed and to have been loosed in the perfect. Be sure you check out the paradigm in Bbg of contract verbs and what they look like when they're infinitives. There's some weird contractions going on, so make sure you check that. And also notice that the infinitive of Amy is enai, epsilon iota, smooth breathing, circumflex, nu alpha iota. Just have to memorize that. Okay, that's it for the form of the infinitive. Let's move over to how you translate these things. Let me give you just some general clues. Obviously, the easiest way to translate an infinitive is just to put the word to in front of it. To eat, to sleep, that kind of stuff. That will get you out of most translational problems with infinitives. Okay, so just to plus the verb. Remember that we're outside of the indicative system, so there's no time significance. It's purely one of aspect, and so you have continual, undefined, and completed. But as we saw with subjunctives, so also in infinitives, it's really hard to get the continual nature of the continuous infinitive across in your translation. You might want to kind of artificially put the word continually in there, to continually study. But that's pretty awkward English, and so it'll be up to your preaching, teaching, and Bible study to convey the true notion of a continuous infinitive. When it comes to the completed infinitive, those formed in the perfect, you can use have. To have eaten generally conveys the significance in English. There is another thing generally, though, in translating infinitives, and that is the whole issue of the subject of the infinitive. Now, an infinitive is an infinite verbal form. Okay, are you familiar with what finite means? When we talk about a finite verb, we talk about a verb that's limited. That's what finite means. A finite verb is limited by its subject. Okay, so there's going to be masculine, feminine, neuter, perhaps, or singular, or plural, but a finite verb is limited by its subject. These are infinite constructions, so there can technically be no subject. And yet, often in Greek, you will find a word functioning as if it were the subject of the infinitive, much like the noun or pronoun of the genitive in a genitive absolute functions as if it were the subject of the participle. But you can have this, quote, subject of an infinitive. And in most cases, that subject is going to be in the accusative case. There are a few verbs that when they are formed, when they're infinitives, that their subjects are going to be in the dative. But in the vast majority of cases, you can find a word in the accusative functioning as if it were the subject of the infinitive. So, for example, Jesus, the Bible says, he did not permit, and then you have your infinitive, to speak, and then ta daimonia, the demons. Well, the demons are in the accusative case. They're functioning as a subject of lalein. And so you have, he did not permit the demons to speak. Okay, so the word in the accusative is functioning as if it were the subject of the infinitive. All right. Just a couple of the quick odds and ends, and we're going to get into some more detailed stuff for how you translate these things. As you might expect, if you're going to negate an infinitive, you'll have may, okay, because we're outside the indicative system. In terms of parsing, there's only 5 things. You just say tense voice, and then in the mood slot, say infinitive. So it's an aorist passive infinitive from, and then give the lexical form, and then, too loose, or whatever the inflected meaning is. And in terms of deponent, remember that deponency is not an issue of mood, it's an issue of the tense voice. And so erchomai, for example, in the present infinitive is going to have a deponent form as well. All right, good. Okay, let's get into some specifics of how you translate infinitives. And there are 5 basic ways that infinitives are translated. Number 1 is that they're translated as a substantive. This is the easiest, most natural one. In other words, you'll come along and you'll see generally, not always, but generally the article and the infinitive, they're functioning as a noun, and you'll just put the word to in there and it will make sense. Paul says, for example, to me, and then tozein, and that's the infinitive of an alpha contract. That's why you need to look at the paradigms. For me to live, and then Christos is in the predicate. For me to live is Christ. All right? So that's the first way, as a substantive. The second way to translate an infinitive is as a complementary infinitive. And again, like in English, this is going to be, you're going to find this when you're connected to certain kinds of verbs. And in fact, in Greek, there are 5 verbs that are always followed by a complementary infinitive. But these will be a very natural thing for you to translate. So, for example, if you had he began, he began lalein. He began to speak. All right? So complementary infinitives, the infinitive is completing the meaning of the verb. So that's first and second. The third way to translate infinitives is a little more awkward because we don't have this construction at all in English. And so they're very idiomatic in how we translate them. And basically what you should do for these is make a separate vocabulary card. And you'll see why in a second. But this is the construction where you have a preposition plus an articular infinitive. So preposition, the article, and the infinitive. And these specific 6 forms have their own special meaning, okay? The first 3 combinations are all indicating reason or purpose, all right? And what you're going to see in these 3, and there are 3 different prepositions, is that you're going to have a preposition, then you're going to have an article, and the article in these 3 will always be accusative. And then you're going to have your infinitive, and you might have a not a direct object, you might have another word in the accusative that's functioning as the subject of the infinitive. Let me give you the first example, and I'll show you. You may see something like this: dia ta blepein auton. Okay, here's how you remember it. Dia with an articular infinitive means because. Okay, that's your vocabulary card. Dia with an articular infinitive means because. So if you have dia ta blepein auton, you would translate that as because he sees. So you can't say to see because we just don't have this construction in English. So you have to translate the infinitive as a regular verb. And the auton is functioning as a subject, the infinitive in this example. So it is dia with the articular infinitive is because, and then he sees. Okay, so that's your vocabulary. Dia with the articular infinitive, backside it means because. Okay, the second preposition that's going to occur like this is ace. and ace is indicating purpose. And so you're going to say on your vocabulary card, ace with an articular infinitive, and flip it over, and it's going to say, in order that. So if you have ace ta blepein auton, it's in order that he sees. Okay? Okay, the third preposition that will occur like this is pros. And pros with the articular infinitive, again, means in order that. So if you have pros ta blepein auton, it's in order that he sees. Okay, so here are the first 3 of the 6 prepositions that occur with an articular infinitive and have a special meaning when you join them with the articular infinitive. Dia means because, and ace and pros both mean in order that. Okay? All right, so those are constructions that indicate reason or purpose. The other 3 prepositions that occur with the articular infinitive are all temporal, and they're going to mean before, when, and after. Okay, those are the 3. In fact, you might even be able to guess what prepositions I'm going to be talking about. Sometimes the articular infinitive occurs with pra. And when you have pra, the article will always be in the genitive. And the pra plus the articular infinitive means before. Okay? So if you have pra tu blepein auton, it's before he sees. Did you get that? Okay. The 5th, or the next preposition, is en. En will always be followed by the article in the dative, and it means when or while. So if you have en to blepein auton, it's when he sees. And the 6th and final is the preposition meta. Meta will always be followed by an article in the accusative, and it's going to mean after, and that one's really easy to remember. So if you have meta ta blepein auton, it's after he sees. Okay, so you have 6 new vocabulary cards, and each of these prepositions with the articular infinitive, and make sure that you memorize them as such. And by the way, on these articular infinitives, sometimes when I get really stuck, I have kind of an artificial thing that I do, but it gets me through the passage. I use the phrase the act of in connection with the infinitive, and then I say with reference to the word in the accusative, the act of with reference to. And so, for example, if I would see something like en to blepein auton, and I got stuck, I would say, I'd recognize what it is, and then I would say, okay, that means in the act of seeing with reference to him. Okay, how do I say that in English? Oh, when he sees. Okay, that's just something I do. It may not be helpful, but that's something that's gotten me out of some problems. Okay, so that was all the third use of the infinitive. It's the preposition plus the articular infinitive construction. 6 different ways that prepositions are going to be used. Okay, we have 2 more ways in which we're going to translate infinitives. The 4th is to indicate purpose. In other words, the infinitive is used to indicate purpose. And we've already seen one way in which the infinitive indicates purpose, haven't we? Yeah, if you have ace or pros with an articular infinitive, they are indicating purpose in order that. All right. The second way an infinitive can indicate purpose is when you simply have the article in the genitive in front of it. You'll have to, and then you'll have the infinitive form of the verb. In other words, if you saw tu blepein autus, make it plural, tu blepein autus, this would mean in order that they see. Okay, so you don't have to have the preposition in order to get the in order that idea. So you have an articular infinitive, but the article is going to be in the genitive, all right? The third way to indicate purpose is simply the infinitive all by itself. Now, this doesn't happen a whole lot, but it can. In other words, you could have blepein all by itself, and it could be translated in order to see. And what will happen in this case is that you'll see the blepein, and you'll go along and you'll translate and go, it doesn't make any sense. Oh, purpose fits this context. Okay. So 3 ways in which an infinitive is used to indicate purpose. Ace and pros with an articular infinitive, the article in the genitive with the infinitive, or the article simply all by itself. Okay? All right. Well, the 5th and final way in which infinitives are used is to indicate result. And this is when you have hosta, the omega with the rough breathing, sigma tau epsilon, when you have hosta with an infinitive. Now, what's awkward about this construction is we have nothing like it in English. And so we're going to have to take the infinitive and translate it as a regular verb. But when you see hosta followed by an infinitive, you know that the author is indicating result, okay? And so you have, for example, the verse that said they filled up, both the boats were filled up, and then you have hosta, and then you have the infinitive buthidzistai and auta. Okay, now auta is in the accusative, and that they're referring back to the ploion, back to the boats, with the result that to sink them. Okay, with the result that they began to sink. Okay, it's how you have to do it. But again, because it's so idiomatic, you have to look at what it is grammatically in Greek and then ask yourself, how do I say the same thing in English? Okay, so those are the 5 uses of the infinitive in Greek. So that's pretty good. Well, let's get into our summary. We learned that an infinitive is an indeclinable neuter verbal noun that will often be preceded by the article, and that article will likewise be neuter singular, but it will change its case depending upon how the infinitive is functioning in the sentence. We learned the infinitive morpheme chart. So in the present, the infinitive is ein and esthai, first aorist, psi, sasthai, thenai, second aorist, ein, esthai, enai, and in the perfect, kenai, sthai, sthai. In terms of translating infinitives in very general terms, you just put a to in front of it. There's no time significant, only aspect. The continuous aspect is hard to come into English, but the undefined and the perfect, in which case you use have, is pretty straightforward. And there often will be a word in the accusative that's acting as if it were the subject of the infinitive. In terms of specific translation, we saw 5 ways in which we will be translating the infinitive. They function as a substantive, often as an articular infinitive in this case. The infinitive can be a complementary infinitive. And we saw that there are 6 prepositions which, when joined with an articular infinitive, have a very specific meaning. Dia will mean because, eis and pros will mean in order that, pra will mean before, en will mean when or while, and meta will mean after. We saw that an infinitive is used to indicate purpose, and it'll either be eis or pros with the articular infinitive, or just the simple article with the infinitive, in which case the article is going to be genitive, or the infinitive by itself can indicate purpose. And fifth and finally, we saw that hosta plus an infinitive can indicate result. Because we don't have this construction in English at all, you're going to have to translate the infinitive not with the to word, but as a regular verb. Okay, that's it for the infinitive. Very good. You may want to take a look at the discussion in the advanced information about indirect discourse. It probably is too advanced for first year, but you may find it interesting. So have a good time with your vocabulary and your workbook. Dikaios, dikaia, dikaion. Right, just, righteous. Mellow, I am about to.